today from data void to data driven. It's really a project that Prism Bio, my company, did with Janssen Clinical Innovation. And the output of this is something, it's very, very new. I'm really excited about it. I'm excited to be sharing it to this community in particular. So I'll sort of get to that here at the end. But overview, what I'm going to talk about. So start with a little bit of background and disclosure. Then I'll talk about, what is a data void? So, that looms large in the title of my talk. I'll say a little bit about what that is. That's really kind of where I focus, or where I focus both as an academic and now sort of the stuff that I focus on at Prism. And then talk about kind of this particular challenge of a particular data void around trying to map the use of digital health technologies in the data set of clinicaltrials.gov. Then I'll talk about how we went about tackling that. So creating an ontology of digital health technologies, then turn to some of the results that we found, and then talk about this next step that we've taken, which is this idea of a digital health vault that I'm excited to share, and then conclusions. And also, I'm excited to see that this is the version of the slides that ended up there. You notice the enumeration is wrong. Just quickly to comment on that, just because I think this stuff is super interesting. So these slides started their lives as Google slides, exported into PowerPoint, and so the enumeration didn't work. But I can't tell you how many times I have looked at these slides and did not notice until like very late last night that the numbers were wrong. And so it just speaks to like the psychology of like how, when whatever, it's like when your attention is sort of like distracted, right? It's just very easy to sort of look over things and think like, oh yeah, there's numbers there. It doesn't matter what they are. Anyways, but that is the order that we're gonna go, even if the numbers are wrong. Okay, so about Prism Bio, just very, very quickly. So we're a science-first software company. We were founded in 2020. And really, we're kind of focused on what I like to call the sort of data to knowledge bottleneck. So, we live in a time of big data. There's tons of data. We've heard about all the data, over the 3 days. I'm sure, all of us in the room. Data is a huge part of what we think about and what we have to deal with every day. But there's this distinction between, data and knowledge, right? So, data is, as I like to think of it, it's sort of, rows in a table, right? That's not the same as actually being able to make sense of it and do something with it. Sort of take that information and turn it into actionable knowledge. Like, that typically requires a lot of time still, right? It's like we're sitting on mountains of data, like actually analyzing it and putting it to use remains a challenge. And that's sort of bottleneck of going from data to knowledge is really where we like to focus. I'll skip the stuff about me because we already talked about that. And then just, quick disclosure, co-founder of Prism Bio, like you've heard, we work with pharma companies, we work with academic institutions as well. So, some of that, of course, bear that in mind with my potential biases here as we go along. Okay, so what is a data void? So, I want to acknowledge Christian Jerhus, who was until recently the, I believe, Chief Digital Officer of Transformation at Novo Nordisk, who in a conversation sort of introduced me to this idea. So I was talking with him about, what do you see as the biggest data gaps in your experience, right? And he sort of laughed at me and he's like, Spencer, like, all I see are data gaps out there, right? So you can't ask me to kind of like pick, the biggest one. It's just a data void. And this was sort of a head scratcher for me at the time, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought this is actually a really important concept. Because, again, it's like we live in a time where it seems like there is so much data, there is too much data, and yet, in a way, I think it's really sort of reveals at the same time, like how little we know, how little of that data we're actually able to act on, and also like how still we lack the data that we would really want. And so one way of thinking about this is if you imagine, with the digital health sort of transformation that we're living through now, think about all the data that's going to exist and be accessible 50 years from now, right? And compare that, if you can sort of imagine to where we are today, and I think it sort of helps, at least in my imagination, makes it sort of concrete, like, well, what is, really we are living in this data void relative to where we will be in the future, right? So that's one way of understanding the concept. Another way of understanding it is just sort of recognizing that, there's lots of data out there. We've heard about this today and throughout the conference so far, the summit. Low quality data, that's not really good data, right? You shouldn't be actually making conclusions on the basis of that data that is low quality or biased or misleading, right? So even though there is tons of data quality, is a contributor to the data void for sure. Data that is untidied, data that is fractured, data that is otherwise hard to analyze, right? There is sort of good data that you might want to sort of put with other good data, but if the effort required to kind of combine these things in ways that are meaningful is very, very great, this is also, I think, a part of this concept of the data void, right? It's sort of like there's knowledge that is latent there, but it is hard to get at, right? And similarly with sort of data that is just unanalyzed, right? Like we have, databases out there with rows that, have the potential to answer important questions that nobody will ask, right? Because there simply isn't time, right? Or maybe because those questions aren't yet important. But nevertheless, right, that's another way of thinking about the data void. And so, all these things kind of combine with the idea that I would want to sort of, push for when understanding the data void, right, is really where this matters is it results in a knowledge landscape that is really mostly gaps, right? When you have a question, you want to answer that question in a way you could sort of articulate what the data would need to be to answer that question. But that data, for all of these reasons, right, is not ready to answer that question, right? Maybe it doesn't exist, maybe it's just not organized, maybe it's just not accessible to you. So that's the sort of idea of the data void. So, particular data void, though, this was a problem that some collaborators at Janssen Clinical Innovation brought to Prism. They have an interest in understanding the landscape of digital health technologies and how they are used in clinical trials. And in particular, they wanted to tap into the clinicaltrials.gov database. So I'm sure I don't need to tell this room, why evidence-based use of digital health technologies in clinical trials is valuable, right? So many reasons why that's valuable. You can measure more, right? Less burdensome on patients. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. But why is this a challenge? So there is actually signal of how digital health technologies and trials are used in clinicaltrials.gov. But that data is not currently structured. There's no field that says you're measuring this outcome. Are you using a particular device to measure it, right? Sometimes that information is there. Oftentimes that information isn't there, right? Sometimes it is described in the background section of a trial, right, where they sort of say like, oh yeah, here's what we're planning to do. We're going to use this particular, smartwatch to measure this, but it doesn't show up in the outcome field, for example, or the structure of the outcome field where you might expect to find it, right? And so there's this challenge, right, of can we nevertheless go into clinicaltrials.gov and try to make sense of this data, right? Surface the information that is there to get a sense of who is doing what with digital health technologies and trials, how are they using these technologies, where are they using them, right? What are they measuring, what are they studying, right? What devices are they using? Because if you want to make good evidence-based decisions about particular devices and how you might fold them into your trial, this is exactly the kind of view that you would want to have, right? You would love to have this sort of high-level picture of what is going on. There was sort of an extra component of the work that we did, where they were also interested in this question for reasons of sustainability. That is, they were starting to track the e-waste, right? For devices that get used in clinical trials, how many of them are there? What happens to these devices? So one of the collaborators on this project, Jason LaRoche, is very involved with use of digital devices in the circular economy. And so he sort of was interested in, not only can we find, particular devices, how are they being used, but can we even estimate the sort of, number of devices themselves, right, in order to get a picture of like how much e-waste might there be in clinical research in order to quantify that and then develop policies around it. Okay, so that was the challenge. The place we started was, again, because we know that clinicaltrials.gov is sort of limited in its scope, right? Like people don't necessarily have to, or they certainly don't have to report this information in there. There aren't fields there for them to report this information. And so, we expected the sort of reporting to be spotty. And so we wanted some sort of other valid data sets or other data sets that we could use to potentially validate against this. And so at the start of this project, we kind of went on this tour where, our collaborators at Janssen, they sort of pulled their internal data. We actually got some folks at Novo Nordisk to do the same thing, to share with us. What we found, though, is that actually even the internal data sets were really quite, limited, I'll say, in that we could find actually evidence in clinicaltrials.gov records where they reported using a device that wasn't in the internal sort of data set, right? So a trial that sort of, if you went to the public record said, oh yeah, we use this device, right? That was not in their internal set, and vice versa, right? Sort of internal records about, oh yeah, we used, a Samsung, watch or whatever it is, or Philips watch, I think actually was more common, but no record, no evidence of that in the clinicaltrials.gov record, right? And so that was sort of one challenge that we had to sort of grapple with, was sort of recognizing that, where is ground truth going to be? Like, we don't believe that clinicaltrials.gov is ground truth, although it is a sort of comprehensive sort of public record that you can use to get some insight. But if internal data isn't ground truth, right, either, or there's evidence to sort of doubt the ground truth there, then we have this, there's sort of a further challenge of like, how are we going to make sense of this data? We also went around then to device manufacturers, right, and asked them, do you track, when you provide devices to particular sponsors for their trials, do you actually track information about like what trials those get used in, right? Because that's what we need. We need to be able to link up particular devices to particular trials. We found that generally that was just not the case. Similarly with electronic data capture companies, it just seemed, nobody really was recording the data in a way that would allow us to actually plug it in to get this picture that we were after. So another thing we asked, did anybody have even an ontology? So maybe by show of hands, do people know what an ontology is? Who in the room? Yeah, a few people. Okay, great. So I'll skip ahead because I have an example that maybe makes sense of it, but it's sort of a key step here. So this picture here is sort of represents the ontology that we built. It's one particular device and how that information is structured inside an ontology. So you can think of an ontology as like a taxonomy with kind of extra pieces to it, right? So in addition to describing the kinds of things that you are interested in, the categories of objects that you want to classify, you can also sort of rigorously describe the relationships between them and how these different things should be related to each other, right? So if you look at the picture, we have our ActiWatch L here down at the bottom, right? And then sort of the yellow branching bar, that's a sort of is relationship. But basically what we're saying is the ActiWatch L is a sensor box type device, which is a subclass of wearable devices, which is a subgrouping of digital health technology, right? And in the ontology, you sort of make these relationships explicit and you provide definitions for all of them. And it's this really nice way of sort of structuring your data, right? So digital health technology is the overarching category. We have classes for wearables, non-wearables, lifestyle devices, right? Each of those has a bunch of subclasses underneath it, and every device had to have some classification, right, in the ontology. Additionally, then we have this is manufactured by relationship, right? So Philips is a manufacturer, right? So it falls under the manufacturer category, right? And then we have these measurement components, right? So an accelerometer, an ambient light sensor, these were both, components of the particular device, right? And so this sort of structure, if you can imagine, we ended up doing 500 of these for our study, but what we ended up sort of building is this sort of logical structure and data structure that allows us to sort of just enter devices, capture them, with these different sort of relationships and classifications. And that ends up being really, really nice when you want to do analyses. And if you think about building on this ontology, for example, right, you sort of, can preserve lots of these nice logical properties such that the data stays tidy and allows you to draw conclusions from it. Like later on, we can say, okay, I want to look at all of the devices that include an accelerometer, right? And I want to know, who are the manufacturers of those devices and how many trials have those manufacturers done, who have they, partnered with, where have those trials taken place. You can sort of get all of that off of the ontology because it has this nice structure. Okay, so to go back a step then, basically what we in the end decided to do is that we were just going to sort of start from scratch. We sort of, again, did another kind of tour asking, does anyone have an ontology for digital health devices? What we heard is no. So we decided, all right, we're going to create one. And so we use the web ontology language standard. There's nice tools available for this. There's a nice repository that has lots of great scientific ontologies hosted by Stanford. And we sort of followed those standards and built out this ontology, starting quite simple. So if you've worked with ontologies, you may be like horrified with the simplicity of what I showed. But my thought was, let's just sort of keep it simple. That allows us to classify these things in the beginning. We can always make it more complicated later if we need to. Populated it with 500 devices, so we basically got lists from our different partners, so Janssen, Novo Nordisk, like I mentioned. There's a couple other public lists out there of like devices that have been used in trials, and we put 500 devices in there just to sort of a nice round number. Let's get a sense of what we see. And then what we did is, what Prism sort of especially is able to provide, is we have algorithms that could sort of then automatically search, go through every device in the ontology, do a search on clinicaltrials.gov, pull down all of the metadata about that study, and then, we can nicely analyze across our data set, how many trials are there, what particular devices did they use, et cetera, and that allows us to get this picture of the landscape that we were after. We also then did a keyword sensitivity search analysis, so we did a sort of broader search that didn't rely on particular devices. It was just sort of taking keywords about digital health technologies to try to get a sense of like, if we went really, really broad, how much of the universe do we think we're actually capturing? But that was sort of the basic structure for the project. I already talked about this slide, so again, this shows you the ontology. We published this ontology at the Stanford's BioPortal. There's the link there, but if you just go to BioPortal, you can type in like digital health technologies. It's free, like anybody can just sort of take that and build upon it, and that's one of the things I want to emphasize throughout this talk, is that, I would be delighted if there are people in this audience who want to take what we've done and build upon it. Prism is not a digital health company. We are a science company, a data science company. And so we really are looking for partners who, or sort of collaborators in this space who are interested in digital health, who might be able to help us, sort of grow and build on this work. Okay, so what did we find? So, we published our results in the journal Therapeutic Innovation and Regulatory Science. There's a lot packed into this paper. I'm just going to talk about a little bit of it. But basically, we can sort of focus on the excerpt of Table 1. So, we found around, it was basically like 2,300 trials that used these 500 devices. We estimated using enrollment numbers and then some multiplier based on the type of device. Because, some devices you would think, it's going to be one device per participant, and some it's going to be, multiple devices per participant, depending on how many, the dose and schedule, for example, or something like that. So we estimated that amounted to, around 289,000 actual devices that have been provisioned so far. But if you look at sort of planned enrollment, you can see the numbers are much, much bigger, right? It looks like millions more devices are potentially going to be provisioned for research. And again, if you think about, we're really looking at 500 devices only. That's really a small sample. So again, I'm sure not news to the people in this room that there is a ton of digital health technologies that are going to be used in clinical research. But it was really sort of striking to me, at least, to see that we're at this kind of nascent stage, but there's so much more that is coming. And I'll hit on a couple of the high-level trends. So this shows the the trial volume by these different classes that we use. So we had, as I mentioned, lifestyle devices, non-wearables, packaging, wearable devices. Other is sort of, I'm not happy with that category, so this is another thing to be improved upon with the ontology. But basically that included like ingestibles and like subcutaneous kind of like implants is what ended up being in there. But a lot of this activity is actually driven by, what we found was driven by continuous glucose monitors. So, those devices are complicated. They oftentimes have multiple different parts. But, there was a lot of sort of the newer devices that involve, sort of an implant and sometimes a handheld device, sometimes a wearable device as well, right? But diabetes really seemed to be kind of a major driver, at least in the sample of the data that we looked at. But you can see kind of wearables are really the biggest group here by far, that's really sort of driving a lot of what we saw. Talk a little about trials by sponsor type as well. So this is one of the nice things is that like you get sponsor type off of clinicaltrials.gov. And what we saw is that if you look at kind of more recent work in particular, it's really academic, so universities and research hospitals that are driving a huge part of this activity. Although, that wasn't always the case. So if you sort of go back right into, 2007, 2008, 2009, you can see actually industry was kind of an earlier, seems to be an earlier adopter, right? But then, in more recent times, it's really been sort of the academic sector that has sort of picked us up, and they're really running with it, much more than industry, and certainly much more than government as well. And so there's interesting, this is maybe something we can talk about in the question period, but I'd be curious if people have thoughts about that, but nevertheless, it's sort of an interesting pattern, I think. Okay. Let's see, yeah, I did skip a slide. Okay, so, one paper. I'm very proud of that paper. I think it's great what we saw. I really think, that's really just the beginning of, where this work would need to go if you wanted to have kind of the complete story about digital health technologies and trials. But, it's kind of the nature of a lot of this work, right? And again, coming from academia, like this is what every project was like. It's like we spend a ton of time, a ton of resources gathering data. We write up one paper, publish it, submit all the stuff as a supplement onto the next, right? But I know that oftentimes in these data sets, right, there are thousands of stories in there, right, that just never get told, right? Again, this sort of goes back to this idea of the data void. And so one of the things that, I've been able to do now with Prism, right, is sort of explore opportunities and sort of leveraging, particularly the new technologies around generative AI, right, to actually sort of say, well, what if we could tell all of those stories, right? There's a ton of stories in that data set that we collected, right, that isn't just sort of summarizing things at the high level, but there might be a story about every individual class, every subclass, every individual device, every manufacturer, every component, right? There's sort of a story about like, well, how has that been used in studies? Who's doing those studies, where, et cetera, right? What if we could tell all of those stories? And so sort of the next step that we've taken is actually written what I call an analytic recipe. But if you like, it's just sort of a way of, saying like, what are the questions that I would ask about a manufacturer, right? Like, what do I want to know about them, what trials they've done, how their devices have been used, et cetera. What do I want to know about components? What do I want to know about classes, right? If I can write down that recipe, right, then now what I have is an algorithm, right? And I can apply this across the entire data set. And leveraging some of the generative AI technologies, I can actually do more than just sort of produce a bunch of charts, right? I can actually use generative AI to tell a story, right? To get it to sample the data, right? And start to sort of synthesize it, to move it in the direction of actually producing, the goal is a high quality scientific report, right? That I didn't have to write, right? Instead, I just sort of said, this is what I want, right? And we can actually create that. And so that's what we've done with this sort of what I'm calling a knowledge vault, which I'm really excited to share. And you can go look at this actually right now. So, vaults.prism.bio will take you to the landing page for what we call our digital health vault. But basically, it is that data set where we applied this process of basically analyzing every element in the ontology and creating a report about it that goes through and sort of, as you see, this is just the wearables page. This is a mix of logic and then, sort of charts, data science kind of stuff, and then some generative AI to sort of summarize it, to sort of say, what are the questions this chart and this data is supposed to answer, right? And we sort of ask, we prompt the AI to, write us the answer to those things, right? But it's all like generated for us. This is about like 800 pages, right? For every class, every subclass, every manufacturer, every individual device, right? Broken down, linked together in sort of Wikipedia-like ways, right? Such that, you can click on these links that lists all like the subgroups, you can just click on them, you can sort of browse it around very quickly. You can call up analyses that, I may not be interested in, but, if you're a particular manufacturer. So for example, I was thinking, throughout this conference, when I'm listening to, the presentation from Samsung, right? I'm looking at the Samsung page, right? And sort of see like, well, what did we see in our data set? Hexoskin is in there, right? The Oura Ring is in there, right? Not everything is in there. Again, we only sampled kind of a small piece of this, but I really think, this is a very, in my view, as a sort of scientist, a really exciting new development, right? Is this opportunity to start creating the thousands of research artifacts out of these data sets that would never have been created before, right? To turn this data into knowledge that can just be accessible and waiting there for you. So I will conclude then by sort of, emphasizing that I really see this as the beginning, right? So as I mentioned, we're not a digital health company, we're a data science company. My hope is that in sharing, this work, the vault, making the data accessible to this group, that there may be those of you in the audience who can see the power in having this kind of like landscape view. And it would be great to connect. I would love to sort of find ways that we might be able to sort of sustain this and build on it together. We want this to be free, basically. So, I'm not selling you this, the digital health vault, like that's just up there. I want this to be a resource that can grow and can sort of do the work that, our partners at Janssen, when they approached us, they wanted it to do. This is the kind of thing that we want to do at Prism, to sort of make knowledge accessible in this way. And then I'll sort of say one other thing about how I see this as only the beginning, is that like, there's a ton of things that I don't like about the way that generative AI currently like writes and does this work, but I know that like that's going to improve over time. So it tends to be like really flowery and it like wants to say things and it's like, no, like let's keep it, sober in the beginning. But there's all sorts of ways in which like the vault could be improved. But to me, it's this really sort of, I think, signifies this profound shift now where, when we create valuable data, we don't have to sort of just, let it sit in the file drawer, right? We don't have to just ask it to, tell us the answer to one question. We can really start thinking bigger. And the time that we would spend, writing up one paper, preparing one report, I think this shows that, we can start thinking about preparing 1,000 reports, right? Really going deep and wide and being able to unpack this data, right? So that when we need the knowledge, it's there for us. We're not looking at weeks of time or, putting it on the desk of our data scientists, right? And saying, come back to me when you have an answer, right? We can generate these things up front. And I think that's incredibly exciting. So I want to thank you all again for your attention and thank the organizers for the opportunity. And I'll stop there.